I was just a kid in Savannah. The city is beautiful, historical, full of live oaks draped in Spanish moss. But in the 80s and 90s, it felt like a place time had overlooked. I saw Fort Stewart nearby, felt the military presence in my life, but my own existence seemed aimless. I was 19, full of energy and an insatiable curiosity for the world beyond the swamps and the Georgia coast. Enlisting wasn't a casual decision. It was a quest for definition. I grew up hearing the stories of my grandfather, who served in World War II, and my father, who returned haunted but proud from Vietnam. For my family, serving was more than a duty. It was the rite of passage. I wanted to be part of that lineage, to feel the weight of history and to prove my worth. I wanted my life to mean something more than selling insurance or fixing cars. When I signed the papers, pride swelled in my chest. I saw the future in vivid colors: discipline, purpose, adventure, and yes, respect. I remember the first day I put on the uniform. I looked in the mirror and no longer saw a boy. I saw a soldier. It was a moment of pure certainty, a promise that I would do the right thing and bring honor to my family. I was ready to take on the world. The reality, of course, was harsher than my fantasy. Basic training was calculated torture, designed to strip us of our individuality and mold us into a cohesive unit. The Georgia heat in the training fields was a prelude to what was coming. We learned to shoot, crawl, and most importantly, to trust the man next to us implicitly. I was transforming. The adventure I sought was, in truth, a lot of sweat, little sleep, and iron discipline. But my life took a sharp turn when the letter arrived. It wasn't about a new guard post in Germany or routine drills. The letter, cold and formal, informed me I was being deployed to the theater, a euphemistic way of saying war, the Middle East. In that moment, fear mixed with the pride. It wasn't the childish fear of the dark. It was the existential fear of sudden, random, violent death. My stomach twisted, and the air turned cold, even in the Savannah summer. I read and reread the paper, and every word seemed to seal my fate. I remember going to my father. He was on the porch sitting in his rocker. When I showed him the letter, he read it in silence without moving a muscle. My father, who never cried and rarely smiled, he was the very definition of a tough man. He looked at me, and I saw in his eyes not just pride, but the silent terror of someone who had been there before. He didn't give me a triumphant hug. He didn't talk about flags or honor. He just looked me in the eyes, with an intensity I never forgot, and said, his voice husky, "Keep your head down, son, and come home whole." In that one sentence, I understood everything. War wasn't about heroes. It was about survival. It was about the probability of a 19-year-old making it back to his front door. The weight of the uniform doubled. I still felt the pride of service, but it was now tinged with a dark knowledge. The life I knew, the dreams I had, could be abruptly cut short, thousands of miles away, by a force I could barely imagine. That night I packed my gear, and every item I put inside, the razor, the socks, the photo of my mother, felt like a farewell. The goodbye at the station was quick and painful. I tried to be the strong soldier for my mother, but when I looked back and saw her silhouette shrinking, I knew my life as a boy was over. I was being thrust into a brutal reality, with nothing but my training and the fear that propelled me every step of the way. Aboard the transport plane, looking at the receding lights of the American coast, the only thing that calmed me was the certainty that I was doing what was expected of me. I was going. I was a soldier, and I had a promise to keep, to come home whole. A promise that, as I soon learned, war rarely allows one to keep easily. The disembarkation was a punch to the gut. The smell was the first thing to hit me, a chemical mixture of burnt diesel, hot sand, oxidized metal, and something I would only later recognize as pure fear. We left the humid, green Georgia behind for a scorching heat that seemed to steal the oxygen from our lungs. The runway was makeshift, surrounded by cargo ships and a fine orange dust that coated everything, embedded itself in the uniform, and never truly left. There was no time to process the environment. We were shoved into trucks, and suddenly, We were in the middle of nowhere. The first week was a stressful blur. Training at Fort Stewart taught us to shoot and march, but it didn't prepare us for the chaotic reality of the theater of operations. The rules were different, the enemy was invisible, and danger came from all sides at all hours. The landscape was hostile, monotonous, and at the same time, deceiving. Every dune, every abandoned structure, every pile of sand could be hiding a threat. Adrenaline became our normal state. I was on a reconnaissance patrol in a convoy. It was midday, the sun was a hammer on my head, and the objective was simple: map a supply route that had been attacked days earlier. I was in the back of a Humvee, my eyes glued to the desert. What surprised me wasn't the noise that came, but the silence that preceded it. A silence that felt taut, unnatural. And then, all hell broke loose. It wasn't a coordinated cinematic attack. It was sudden, brutal, and disorganized. We were passing through a dip in the road when the first sharp rifle shots rang out. The sound wasn't the pop-pop of drills. It was a dry, cracking sound that echoed. My body acted before my mind registered. I yelled the alert, jumped out of the vehicle, and dove for cover behind a pile of rubble. I remember two things with agonizing clarity. The first was the smell of hot metal and gunpowder. The second was the sound of Captain Miller shouting orders that I could barely hear over the adrenaline and the ringing in my ears. Dirt was flying everywhere. I saw, just a few feet away, the impact of bullets on the metal of our Humvee. In that moment, the last of my innocence, the naive pride of the young man from Savannah, died. I was in a real fight, with real men trying to kill me. Fear transformed into something cold and sharp, cutting away all emotion, leaving only the instinct for survival. There was no room for hesitation. I chambered around, peeked over the cover, and returned fire. The first shot I fired with the intent to hit someone at a distant moving figure is seared into my memory. It's a hazy image, but the feeling is palpable, a mixture of nausea and primitive satisfaction. No matter what they say about training, nothing prepares you for the moment you act with the intention of taking a life to save your own. The confrontation lasted perhaps 15 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. 15 minutes of chaos, yelling, smoke, and the feeling of standing on the precipice. We managed to repel the attack and secure the route. No serious losses in our unit that day, fortunately, just cuts and bruises. When the shooting stopped and the silence returned, it was different. It wasn't the tense silence from before. It was a heavy silence, a silence of mourning for something that had been lost. I went up to Captain Miller, my body shaking uncontrollably. He gave me a pat on the shoulder and said, "You did what you had to do, Callahan. Welcome to the war." That night I barely slept. It wasn't the physical pain that tormented me, but the first scar on my soul. The image of my shot, the realization that I was now capable of killing, haunted me. I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer the young man from Savannah. I was a marked soldier. That first direct confrontation didn't just teach me the brutality of war. It taught me the brutality that now lived inside me. From that day on, the world was divided into before and after that first shot. In war, your world shrinks. It comes down to that 1 square meter you're covering and the sweaty, bearded faces of the men next to you. We were thrown together, coming from such different places. Me, from historic Savannah. Sam, from the farmlands of Ohio. Mikey, from the streets of Chicago. And the others. But in hell, differences fade, and the only thing that matters is the blind trust you place in one another. This bond, which we call brotherhood, is the oxygen that kept us from drowning in the chaos. We were the band of 5. We weren't the toughest or the prettiest, we were the ones who laughed at the worst jokes and shared the last candy bar. Communication wasn't through the radio, it was through glances, a subtle nod that said, "I got you covered, go." You entrusted your life to these men in a way that is impossible to replicate in civilian life. It's not just teamwork, it's unconditional love, because one man's failure meant the death of all. I remember one particularly cold and terrifying night. We were entrenched after an intense clash and the tension was palpable. I was shaking, not just from the cold, but from residual adrenaline. Mikey saw me. He didn't say anything, but he pulled his last dry sock from his pack and gave it to me, saying, "Callus, your cold feet are gonna get us killed. Put this on." A sock. Such a small, mundane act, but in that moment, it was worth more than all the gold in the world. It was a silent reminder that, despite the death all around us, there was still humanity and care. Our combat routines were brutal, but the moments of respite were sacred. Sam, our unofficial poet, used to show us the photo of his wife, Carol, which he kept laminated and untouched. He talked about his future with her, about taking her to see the ocean. These were small stories, fragments of a normal life, that kept us tethered to reality. We took turns on watch, but what we were really doing was sharing letters from home, laughing at dumb jokes about the MREs, and sometimes just sitting in silence together, knowing that everyone felt the same terror and exhaustion. This brotherhood was our emotional shield. When one of us messed up or made a mistake, the others corrected it and moved on, without judgment, without argument. There was no time for vanity or grudges. There was only the necessity to stay functional and alive. There was a time we were pinned down in an alley under heavy fire. It felt like we wouldn't make it out. Sam and Mikey, without me asking, moved forward, drawing enemy fire so that I and the others could reposition the machine gun. I saw courage in its purest form, not recklessness but calculated sacrifice out of love for their brothers. War taught us that the greatest value wasn't in the medal we might receive, but in the silent sacrifice we made for each other, every single day. We celebrated small victories, a tiny birthday cake that arrived in the mail, a 30-minute break where no one was shooting, the warmth of a shared cigarette. These fragments of normalcy, experienced together, cemented the bond. They became our anchor, reminding us of who we were and, more importantly, who we were fighting for. Not a distant flag, but to ensure the man next to you made it back to his family. It's a bond that never breaks. Years later, back in Savannah, people ask about the combat. I don't talk about the gunfire. I talk about the men. I talk about the fierce loyalty that bound us in the chaos. This brotherhood forged under fire was the most precious thing I took from the war, and it's why the loss of one of them later became so defining and devastating to my post-combat life. War is a game of chance, and on the morning of that fateful day, the dice rolled against us. It seemed like any other patrol, tedious, hot, and routine. Boredom, I learned, is the antechamber of tragedy. We were in a reconnaissance convoy, checking a route that command suspected was compromised. I was in the driver's seat of the first Humvee. Sam, my brother from Ohio, was in the turret, exposed but alert, humming a folk tune we'd heard on the base radio. He was smiling. It was a cloudless day, with no apparent major incidents. A false sense of comfort. The moment of the explosion wasn't seen. It was felt. There was no clear warning, just a pressure wave on the ground that shot up through the Humvee's suspension, straight into my spine. My mind, trained to perfection, screamed IED in the microsecond before impact. I slammed the brakes, yelled, "Take cover!" But the reaction was too late. The improvised explosive device was large and perfectly positioned beneath the most vulnerable point. The explosion was the most brutally loud thing I have ever experienced. It wasn't a distant boom. It was a shredding roar that tore the air, the metal, and, as I would soon discover, my soul. The force slammed me violently against the steering wheel and dashboard. I felt a crack in my rib, and the high-pitched ringing of a concussion deafened my world. Black and gray smoke was so thick it blinded me, and the smell of diesel, gunpowder, and twisted iron was nauseating. I tumbled out of the Humvee. Instinct took over. I crawled, trying to find cover and fire back to repel any ensuing ambush. The cover fire from the other vehicles started almost immediately, but to me the world had become slow and muted. I was physically intact, but mentally shattered. My only priority, my visceral instinct, was Sam. Sam was in the turret. I called his name, screamed it, but the sound seemed to vanish in the dense air. I crawled, coughing, to where the turret should have been. When the smoke cleared, I saw the destroyed Humvee listing and smoking, and I saw Sam. He was 10 feet away from the vehicle, thrown by the force of the blast. I dragged myself to him, and when I reached him, The world went terrifyingly silent. No cry, no pain, just the final silence. I was there, breathing, feeling the ache of my contusion, the adrenaline pumping, and he was gone. And in that moment, the war of bullets and explosions ended. The war of the mind began. I looked down and saw his wallet lying in the sand. I picked it up almost on reflex. It was open, and there was the photo of Carol, his wife, the one he promised to take to see the ocean. The photo was intact, almost mocking our fragility. In that instant, the question began. Why me? I was the driver. I was in the front. I should have been the first one hit. Why did I come back and he, the man who just wanted to get back to his wife, did not? Survivor's guilt embraced me with a cold grip. It is a parasite. It doesn't let you die, but it doesn't let you live in peace either. It's a debt you feel you can never repay. Our officers prepared us for death, but not for the loss of a brother. Not for having to write the formal letter to his wife, to Carol, knowing that in her hands was the piece of paper that would shatter her life. Looking at that photo and having to sign off, "We regret to inform you." It was the most difficult, most cowardly, and most painful act I ever performed. It was as if I were signing my own sentence, to live forever with the echo of Sam's absence. I buried him with a hero's honors, but to me he was just my brother who wouldn't be going back to Ohio. From that day on, Jim Callahan's real battle became internal. It wasn't against a visible enemy, but against the torturous memory of having survived the man who, in my mind, deserved to live far more than I did. This loss, this cut to the soul, was deeper and more lasting than any physical wound could ever be. People ask about the nightmares. They think they're action movies, vivid shooting scenes. The truth is, the deepest horror of war isn't what you see when you're awake, but what you hear when you try to sleep. For me, the true ghosts of war aren't visible. They are sonic. And worst of all, they came home with me, here, in the peace of Savannah. War is audible, even years later. The nights became my private battlefield. I would lie in bed, and instead of silence, my mind would play an endless audio tape of combat sounds. It wasn't just gunfire. It was the high-pitched ringing of the concussion from the blast that took Sam. It was the choked scream of the man I couldn't save. It was the dry click-click of the magazine running empty at the wrong moment. These were sounds that never left my skull. I developed a permanent state of alert that prevented me from resting. Any noise, a distant siren, a car speeding by, even the creak of my own house, was instantly interpreted by my brain as a threat. My body would go into combat mode. My heart would race, cold sweat would break out, and I would spring out of bed looking for a weapon, for cover. My mind was trapped in the desert, trying to protect me from a danger that had passed years ago. Insomnia wasn't an annoyance. It was torture. Absolute silence was, ironically, the most dangerous sound of all. Silence gave me space to hear the guilt. Sam's voice calling my name. His silence judging me. Survivor's guilt manifests as an invisible weight on your shoulders. It's a burden only you can feel, a cloak made of regret and remorse. You can be sitting at the dinner table, laughing with your family, but your mind is thousands of miles away, on the dusty ground, desperately trying to negotiate with death. This weight is real. I felt physically stooped, crushed by the memory of coming home whole while my brothers did not get that chance. You try to hide it. You smile, you nod, you try to live a normal life, but inside, you're in constant panic. It is terrifying to think that your real enemy is not on another continent, but inside your own skull, reenacting the trauma every night. People say, just get over it. The war is over. They don't understand that war is not an event. It's a condition. It's a chemical and psychological shift that rewrites your brain code. Where there was peace, there is now alertness. Where there was joy, there is now suspicion. My body, here in the peace of Savannah, still responded to the war that happened 20 years ago. I remember one time my wife tried to gently wake me up. My arm acted automatically. I pushed her away and yelled, reacting as if she were a threat in the dark. The pain on her face, the fear in her eyes hit me harder than any bullet. That's when I realized how deeply the war had rooted itself in me. I was terrifying the person I loved most, because of echoes only I could hear. These echoes are a constant reminder that the soldier never truly retires. He can take off the uniform, but he cannot take the battlefield out of himself. This is the silent sentence of those who survive trauma, and the only way to survive the echoes is to find a way to transform them from ghosts into memories that can be managed. A task that proved to be more difficult than surviving direct combat. Coming home was, for me, my biggest culture shock. I thought the hardest battlefield was behind me, in the desert. I was wrong. The real fight began the moment the transport plane landed, and I stepped onto American soil. I expected some kind of cathartic relief, maybe a wave of gratitude or celebration. What I received was silence and an indifference that hurt more than any physical wound. At the airport, there were hugs, of course. My wife, my parents. But soon, life returned to its trivial routine. The world I had left behind was exactly the same. People were upset about the price of gas, complaining about traffic on I-95, or arguing about the taste of coffee. I had come from a place where death was a constant companion, where every breath was a victory. And here, the biggest worry was whether the plumber would show up on time. I felt like an outsider, an alien in my own city. I had been transformed by the combat experience, but the world around me hadn't changed to receive me. They saw the uniform, they saw the hero who had returned, but the man was broken and invisible. I tried to blend in, tried to smile and nod, but the war still lived inside me. The apparent peace of Savannah was unbearable. The moss-draped trees, the quiet strolls, the familiarity of everything, it all felt like a cruel illusion. How could they be so carefree? They didn't understand that our peace was sustained by what my brothers and I had seen and done. This disconnect created an instant barrier between me and the rest of humanity. I was physically here, but my mind was still patrolling, searching for the threat, unable to relax. My attempts to live normally were pathetic. I went to the supermarket and froze in the canned goods aisle, unable to decide. In the desert, choices were binary. Live or die. Here, the complexity of civilian life decisions overwhelmed me. I felt a constant hypervigilance. A balloon popping on the street would make me jump and look for cover, adrenaline flooding my body. People would stare and I felt shame, but I couldn't control it. The difficulty wasn't just the lack of noise, but the lack of clear purpose. In war, I knew who I was and what my job was. Protect the man next to me and survive. At home, who was I now? I was a husband, a son, a citizen. But my inner self was a soldier on high alert. Trying to reconcile those two identities was like trying to mix oil and water. The contrast was suffocating. I remember sitting in my backyard smelling the freshly cut grass, a sound that should have been comforting. But instead my mind replayed the acrid smell of gunpowder. I missed the brutal simplicity of combat, where at least the enemy was clear. At home, the enemy was invisible and internal. This experience made me feel profoundly isolated. I didn't have the vocabulary to explain my condition. How do you tell your wife that her comfort was actually a threat to your nervous system? I started pulling away, retreating into oppressive silence. I needed the war to feel alive, but I hated what it had done to me. And this contradiction became the foundation of my new battle, the fight to find my place in the Georgia I no longer recognized. War doesn't just kill soldiers, it destroys homes. And my return, instead of being a homecoming, was an invasion. I was back, but the man who returned was not the husband and son who had left. I was a soldier on constant alert, and my family was unprepared to live with a ghost. My wife, Sarah, tried. God knows how hard she tried. She wanted me to talk, to open up. But how could I explain to her while she was talking about the kids' tuition hike or the kitchen remodel that in my mind, I was reliving the blast that took Sam? The scale of our worlds was irreconcilable. What was important to her seemed trivial, and what was my reality, the smell of death, visceral fear, was incomprehensible to her. I started building emotional walls around myself. They were walls intended naively to protect them from my darkness. I didn't want to contaminate their peace and innocence with the brutality I had witnessed. The result, however, was the opposite of what I intended. My silence and my isolation created an abyssal distance. I was physically present in the living room, but emotionally thousands of miles away, still on the front lines. One of the hardest times was dinner. They would talk about their day, about work, about the kids. I would reply in monosyllables, keeping my eyes fixed on my plate. Any sudden noise, a slamming door, a dropped plate would make me jump. My overreaction terrified my young children. I saw the fear in their eyes and it crushed me. I was the monster I had promised to protect their world from. Intimacy disappeared. In marriage, you need vulnerability. But on the battlefield, vulnerability is fatal. I brought that lesson home. I couldn't relax, couldn't let down my guard. Sarah would try to touch me, but my body would go rigid. Physical proximity felt like a threat to my hypervigilance. Instead of comfort, I sought isolation. I'd close myself in my office or spend hours in the garage, away from the human warmth that made me feel exposed. Arguments began out of nowhere. Sarah would get frustrated with my irritability and explosive temper. I would lash out over small things, like a towel out of place. But what was behind it was the repressed rage of war, the frustration of not being able to reconnect. I would yell, and the next second I'd pull away, filled with remorse and guilt. I was pushing away the only people who could help me find my way back. I remember Sarah crying, telling me, "I understand you went through terrible things, Jim, but you're here, and the soldier isn't. I want my husband back." That line hit me hard. I didn't know how to let the soldier rest. He was my protection. Abandoning him meant opening the floodgates to panic and pain. My inability to process the trauma created a fracture in the foundation of our family. Home became a place of caution, where everyone walked on eggshells, trying not to step on the emotional landmine that was my mind. I became a familiar stranger, physically the father, the husband, but emotionally a reservoir of darkness that kept them from getting close. This distance, self-imposed, was the most painful and lasting consequence of my war. I had survived death, but I was losing my life and my family in return. When I came home, I thought the fighting was over, but the enemy just changed uniforms. In place of snipers and enemy infantry came depression, anxiety, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. This battle, fought within my own mind, proved to be more relentless and exhausting than anything I faced in the desert. PTSD isn't just about having flashbacks. It's about having your nervous system hijacked. My mind was permanently stuck in survival mode. Anxiety was a car alarm that never turned off. My body was constantly flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. I felt tension in my shoulders, my heart racing even at rest. I was always expecting the next attack, the next shot, the next IED. This left me exhausted, irritable, and unable to focus. Simple tasks, like reading a newspaper or fixing something around the house, became impossible. Depression followed soon after. It was a lead blanket that kept me from moving, from feeling joy, from caring. I looked at my children and felt a void. I couldn't connect to their happiness. Sam's guilt and the frustration of my maladjustment piled up until it became an overwhelming weight. I kept asking myself, why did I fight? What was the point of surviving if I couldn't feel the life I was given back? This existential questioning was a daily torment. I searched for purpose in the civilian world but only found chaos and pointlessness. Treatment was a process of humiliation and resistance. As a soldier, you're trained to be strong, to show no weakness. Admitting that my mind was broken felt like the ultimate defeat. I remember the first session at the VA hospital, sitting in a cold waiting room, feeling like an imposter. I had to learn to talk about what I had tried to bury for years. I had to name my demons. Yes, I have intrusive thoughts. Yes, I feel guilt. Yes, I think about giving up. The therapist explained that I wasn't crazy. My brain was functioning exactly as it was supposed to function to keep me alive in war. The problem was, it didn't know how to switch off. I had to relearn how to live. Exposure therapy was excruciating, reliving combat scenes in a safe environment, forcing my brain to understand that the danger was over. I would sweat, shake, cry out. It was the dirtiest battle I ever fought. I had relapses. I had nights where I felt the only way to silence the echoes was to silence myself. It was in those darkest moments that Sam's promise to take Carol to see the ocean, and the face of my own wife, pulled me back. I couldn't give them another loss. My battle against PTSD taught me that the true enemy doesn't always wear a uniform. It hides in the shadows of your mind. Finding meaning in a world I no longer recognized required a total redefinition of who I was. I was no longer just the soldier who survived. I had to be the man who fought to be human again. And this fight, which continues to this day, became the foundation for my future. The turning point in my life didn't come with a magical cure, but with a brutal epiphany. I had to talk. I had spent years isolated in Savannah, living in the shadow of my own echoes, convinced that my darkness was a burden I had to carry alone. My wife was exhausted. My children were wary. I was on the verge of losing everything. And the irony was that the same silence that protected me in war was slowly killing me at home. The decision to give voice to my story wasn't for ego. It was out of desperation and duty. I was at rock bottom, drowned in depression and Sam's guilt. When I realized I wasn't the only one, I knew that just miles away, in other quiet Georgia homes, there were thousands of other veterans from Vietnam, the Gulf, Iraq, Afghanistan, living the same torment. They were dying in silence, feeling forgotten, invisible to a world that only celebrated the parades but ignored the internal scars. My first attempt to speak was at a small veterans support group at the local hospital. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the water cup. I started talking about the heat, about the sand, but soon I was forced to move to the real pain. Survivor's guilt, insomnia, the fear of closed doors. When I finished, the room was absolutely silent. I expected judgment or pity. Instead, I received slow, firm nods of recognition. One man who hadn't spoken for months in the group raised his hand. He was a Vietnam veteran. He looked me in the eye and said, his voice choked, "I smelled that sand this morning, Callahan. I smelled it." In that moment, I knew. My story wasn't a secret. It was a tool. It was a bridge. It was proof that they weren't alone. I decided my ultimate mission wasn't just to survive, but to be the voice for those who could no longer speak, and for those who lacked the courage to start. I began speaking publicly, at community events, churches, for support organizations. I told Sam's story and the story of the return. I forced the audience to look into the darkness that most preferred to ignore. I said, "I am your neighbor who came back broken. Look at me. Don't close your eyes to the men and women who are still fighting." The impact of those words on other veterans was immediate and profound. They would approach me after the talks, some crying, others just gripping my hand with desperate strength. They would say, "You named my ghost." My courage in exposing my vulnerability gave them permission to feel and to seek help. Sharing the trauma didn't heal the wound, but it transformed it. It stopped being a personal shame and became a greater purpose. My mind still played the echoes, but now, I used those echoes to call others back from the dark. I was finally honoring Sam's memory and the memory of all the others. I was fighting for them, on a new battlefield, with the only weapon I had left, the naked truth of my experience. That voice, which I tried to suffocate for decades, became my redemption. The term legacy used to sound grand and distant, something reserved for generals or world leaders. For me, an infantry soldier, legacy was simply survival. But after decades of fighting internal ghosts, I realized that my true legacy wouldn't be in what I did in war, but in what I did with the pain that war left behind. The pain never fully goes away. Survivor's guilt and the echoes of combat are like deep scars. The skin may have closed, but the tissue is different. What I learned to do was transform it. I took the darkness and used it as fuel for hope. Depression can still try to drag me down. Anxiety still wakes me up at 3 a.m., but now I have an ultimate mission that is bigger than my suffering. My mission is to ensure that the invisible scars, PTSD, anxiety, family breakdown, are not forgotten or devalued by society. I have dedicated my later years to being the bridge between trauma and understanding. I speak, write, and participate in support groups, no longer just as therapy, but as a duty. I ensure that the fight of my brother Sam and thousands of others who came back broken is not in vain. The true act of courage, I discovered, wasn't that moment under heavy fire in the desert, but the daily decision to choose to live. It was coming home, and even with a shattered mind, deciding that I deserved the chance to try to be happy again. It was asking for help when my strength failed. This is the courage I want young veterans to understand. Bravery is reaching out and being open about the pain. My transformation is slow and constant. I learned to forgive the soldier who came back broken and to embrace the man who is trying to rebuild his life. My wife, Sarah, and I had to rebuild our marriage from the ground up, with a new understanding of vulnerability. I still have my bad days, but the difference now is that I have a support network and the certainty that my struggle has a purpose. I often visit the local war memorial in Savannah. I sit there for hours. I think about Sam. I think about the others who didn't come back. And instead of drowning in guilt, I take a deep breath and feel gratitude for the life I have left. My legacy is a commitment to use every beat of my heart to light the way for another veteran lost in the darkness. I want them to know that pain can be redeemed. I remain the echo of the battle, but now I am an echo with a voice. I will not let the sacrifices of war be reduced to statistics or paragraphs in history books. They are lives. They are traumas. They are the cost of our peace. And as long as I can breathe, I will ensure that cost is acknowledged and honored. This is my final mission: to ensure that the pain turns into strength and that the invisible scars are never forgotten. I ensure that the fight of my brother Sam and thousands of others who came back broken is not in vain. The true act of courage, I discovered, wasn't that moment under heavy fire in the desert, but the daily decision to choose to live. It was coming home, and even with a shattered mind, deciding that I deserved the chance to try to be happy again.